We talk about the freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of assembly, but there is one freedom we barely talk about anymore: the freedom to simply live, to go somewhere better, to vote with your feet. And it's the one that historically made all the other possible. We tend to think of sedentarism as the human default and migration as an exception that needs explaining, but what if we have had it exactly backwards the whole time? Look at every major rupture in history: industrialization, colonization, the agricultural revolution, decolonization. Each produced mass movement. If change is constant and change produces migration, then mobility is the norm, and what actually needs explaining is why we stopped moving. We were taught that history moves in a straight line. Hunter-gatherers become farmers, farmers become city dwellers become what exactly? This tidy narrative was popular in the 18th century and abandoned by scholars in the 19th. In reality, nomadism and sedentarism coexisted and alternated for millennia. Traditional societies were mobile, not frozen in place waiting to be civilized. The sedentarism was often not a choice. Early states needed a fixed, taxable, controllable population. Native Americans, for example, actively resisted settlement because they correctly associated it with disease, loss of autonomy, and subjugation. So sedentarism in many cases was not progress, it was a cage. If sedentarism was coerced, then mobility was its opposite, an expression of freedom and political agency. Graeber and Wengrow identified three freedoms characteristic of non-state societies: the freedom of movement, the freedom of disobedience, and the freedom to restructure society altogether. And crucially, the movement made the other two possible. If you can leave, hierarchy cannot become permanent. Migration was never just an economic phenomenon, it was a political act. There is another detail worth noting, that historically people rarely moved alone. They moved in groups, families, clans, entire communities, which meant they carried their social infrastructure with them. The move was hard, but the support system traveled with you. Today we have individualized migration entirely, because you move alone, you explain yourself alone, and you rebuild alone. The collective safety net that once made mobility viable has been dismantled. So how did we lose the freedom of movement? Early states tried to restrict it from the beginning. Scott points out that the Great Wall of China served partly to keep people in, not just enemies out. But for most of history, people could still escape into forests, mountains, and ungoverned territories. What closed that off was the rise of nation-state and the exhaustion of frontier. By the 20th century, every piece of land belonged to some state. There was nowhere left to go without a passport. And today, the passport isn't even enough. Try relocating across borders and you will face visa queues, proof of funds requirements, employer sponsorships, integration courses, health insurance gaps, and the unspoken demand that you justify your existence in a new place to a bureaucrat who has never left their hometown. What was once a human default, just go where life is better, now requires years of planning, legal status, and often a significant amount of luck. The closure of frontiers shut off the political possibility of experimenting with alternatives. You can no longer simply leave a system you disagree with, but there is a more immediate consequence most people feel viscerally. Where you are born increasingly determines how much you will earn. Not your talents or your work ethic, but your coordinates and the zip codes, the passport and the accident of geography. These have become the primary determinants of income in the modern world.